I've spent 35 years in venture capital and private equity investing, and I've come to appreciate the power of capital harnessed to entrepreneurs, innovative business models, and scale economics to transform markets. My biggest wins have been investments in companies that have upended oligopolies, and my biggest losses have come from believing it's easy to do. As a philanthropist, I've been a contributor to efforts in Chicago to improve preschool to high school education with a focus on shoring up a very effective alternative to the Chicago public school system in the inner city, and that is the Catholic school system in Chicagoland, at one point educating over 300,000 kids, now fewer than 75,000. It's a system especially essential to middle and lower income neighborhoods where public school options are often poor. Much has been done. A whole lot needs more to be done to improve inner city public schooling. But like any industry, any market, where consumers have more choices, incumbents are forced to up their game or die. About 10 years ago, I joined the first ever Archdiocese of Chicago-wide school board and learned firsthand how desperately needed and how effective Catholic schools are in our inner city neighborhoods. But I also came to appreciate the dubious sustainability of Catholic schools serving poor and middle income communities, as dependent as they are on philanthropy to survive. The same is true for any public or private school alternative serving inner city families. You know, the average family may make $25,000, $35,000 a year, might be able to contribute $1,000 or $2,000 towards an education that costs $5,000 or $6,000 per student. And as remarkable as the outcomes are for those kids being taught for $5,000, it's surely not enough to be truly excellent or innovative in the long run. It's a system, frankly, hanging on by its fingernails. So I and a handful of co-conspirators determined more had to be done at the policy level to allow low-income families an opportunity to direct their tax dollars dedicated to them, towards better schooling options, which led to the creation of Empower Illinois. And after about 3 years of preparation and advocacy, we managed to get a tax credit scholarship policy passed in Illinois in the summer of 2017, the first of its kind in a blue state, modeled after Florida's very successful program, but with some important handicaps. The program allows individuals and corporations to make donations to scholarship granting organizations that field applications from low and lower middle income families on a first-come, first-served basis. Donors receive a 75% tax income credit, a state income tax credit, of up to $1 million for those donations made to the scholarship granting organizations. Not as valuable as the 100% credit donors receive in Florida, but especially with the new limitations on deductibility of state and local taxes, a powerful incentive for taxpayers. The argument is $1 donation would cost you 25 cents. Now, we would have liked to have made that argument that it would cost you less than 25 cents, but despite our sleeves off your vest arguments, the Illinois polls refused to allow donors to take a federal deduction for the donation as well. The program is capped at $75 million of credits per year and has a 5-year life. Florida's program, now over $600 million per year, is permitted to escalate with demand and has no time limit, which means in Illinois, we're going to have to prove the program's merits and fight for its extension and expansion. So what's happened since passage? We raised more money than any program of its kind in its first year, about $60 million. And demand for scholarships has been off the charts. At least 40,000 applications against the 7,000 or so scholarships that were given away statewide. 650 schools are participating in the program. 400 schools benefited in the first year. There's a complication. Fundraising from corporations has been nearly non-existent, in part because the program is neither fish nor fowl, a tax credit or a donation. Getting corporations to take this up will be key to getting to our cap and beyond. Nonetheless, we have the makings of something here that can sustain and help scale private alternatives and encourage new, innovative private school models to emerge, one of which we're here to talk about. So Myles, explain how a problem, this dearth of corporate giving to the tuition tax credit program, created an opportunity for innovation, a partnership with labor, educators, and philanthropists to tackle a problem we all share.
Sure. I would actually start by first thanking everybody in the room, everybody in the panel, for participating to try to solve problems as it relates to kids in Chicago. What the scholarship has meant for many kids, there's thousands of kids, thousands of stories. I actually think telling the story of a kid who did not get a scholarship helps to illustrate the issue and segue into what we're working on here today. I was recently at a Leo High School down on the south side talking to Dan McGrath, the principal. And he told me about a parent who came in, he'd heard about these scholarships through Empower Illinois, and the parent wanted one desperately. Her son was at another school, and they had moved around between high school and high school, trying to avoid violence and gang turf wars. And she felt like her kid was going to be killed any day. And so he disappointingly had to say, listen, we don't have any scholarships for you. They're all gone. They've been eaten up. There's too much demand. 40,000 kids. Well, how much is it? Well, it's $4,000 to attend here. And her response was, it's cheaper than a funeral. So, the kind of situation on the ground that kids are facing are life and death situations for these kids. And what's sad about this, I think at the end of the day, where does this violence come from? It comes from unemployment, comes from poverty, it comes from a lack of education options that will lead to economic prosperity. And when I look at what I would consider myself, at least currently or probably formerly a part of, is an education reform movement who for 25 years worked to try to improve Chicago public schools through all kinds of efforts. And in that same African American community, we have a 5% college graduation rate. So I think what's exciting is the whole way as we're working on these issues, and our friends in labor have kind of been with us for a long time, we're working on the same problem. We all want these kids to have these kind of opportunities, but the way we're going about it now, it's not working. So I think having this honest assessment and the ability to say, how can we start from scratch and how can we build pathways that lead to opportunity that will be real jobs, right? College for all might not be the recipe for everybody. It may be economic and fiscal prosperity for everybody. So I think we have common agreement that some changes in the policy, we can bring broad partners together and work towards those ends.
So Jim, you're head of the most influential labor organization in the state of Illinois. What's your perspective here? What's the opportunity that you see for this to solve this problem?
I think the opportunity is, and I think before we even talk about the opportunity, I have to talk about the problems we've had in trying to attract African American kids from these neighborhoods into our programs. The competition for jobs in the construction industry in our market is fierce. Last year, in 2017, we opened up for the first time really in quite a few years because of the depression and the lack of need of tradesmen. We don't make them every year unless they're needed. And in our first opening of our apprenticeship application process, we were figuring about 250 to 300 kids the first year. This is just the operators union. You have the electricians, the carpenters, the other trades, all doing the same thing at the same point. We had 5,000 applications for those 250 spots. 40% of those had a 4-year college degree. So, as you can see, and that doesn't necessarily make them the best candidate. In some instances, it makes them probably a little bit handicapped. The kids we find to do the best are the ones that come out of our more rural areas. We cover 3 states, the eastern 7 counties of Iowa, northern Illinois, and northern Indiana, about 1/3 of the northern half. And they come out of those, some of these rural areas still have career-based high schools. And these kids flourish when they come into our programs. And what we wanted to do is to introduce something like we used to have when I grew up in the city of Chicago, career vocational schools. And quite frankly, when it comes to, a minority participation, our minority participation numbers are great. Our African American numbers are abysmal, and we have to reach out for African American candidates. And we've used every program that's come down the pipeline, from state-sponsored, city-sponsored, faith-based type sponsored programs, and having the same result. What we wanted to do was to take the bull by the horns and do it ourselves, which would be really extend our apprenticeship programs down to the high school level. Look at the industry, try to grab kids at that 6th, 7th, or 8th grade level, mentor them, bring their families, get them involved, invite them to our training site, and let them know that with focus and a little hard work, you could grade into this program, this school. And it should be as an elite of a school as the Walter Payton schools are, some of our schools in the city of Chicago, or our charter schools for the trades. And the difference is, at the end of those 4 years, and if let's say you get to that second year and you've decided to become an electrician, we're going to have 4 basic trades that are involved in this, and you'll grade into one of the trades. At the end of that 4-year program, you are immediately plugged into our apprenticeship program, which immediately guarantees you a job and a 4-year education for free. Unlike the 40% of the candidates we have that have applied who are now sitting with college debt and then coming into our program, when they could have from the very beginning just came into the program. So what we're trying to do is do that outreach to try to bring those kids in, instead of waiting until what we traditionally get is that whole theme that when a kid has gone through troubles and let's say he's gone through prison, that we're going to rehabilitate him and put him in the trades. Everybody looks at the trades, and the problem is we're not the island for misfit toys. It's an extremely competitive and highly technical industry anymore. And the only way we're going to help these African American kids that we're trying to target is to run our own program and grab them at an early age, mentor them to get into our program and graduate.
So John, we're grateful to have you here with us. Your work with AEI, with Chan Zuckerberg, with the Walton Family Foundation, you do a lot of work around future planning. That is, how do we make great innovative solutions come to market around schooling? Why is the vocation, the trade area, the trade education area of interest to you?
Thank you. It's great to be on this panel. So thankful for everyone here braving the last day of ASU GSV to be with us too. So everyone gets an industry certification. So. I think I've actually been part of the problem in some ways. Like in my work in policy, even my work in philanthropy over the years, it really has sort of put forward this whole notion of like college for all, in which I do believe college is super important, but we inadvertently, and I think mistakenly, devalued some of these other pathways. And I think there's a number of different issues and forces that are sort of coming to bear right now that are sort of helping to elevate that we need other pathways, not alternative pathways, but other pathways that, to this point, like lead to really good paying jobs and good, stable, middle income lives. And more than that, I think this goes back to why this program is so great, because students are constantly trying to they're trying to figure out what their passions are, what their aspirations are, and then try to figure out what's the best pathway to achieve those. And for a long time, we've been saying college. For some times, we say community college. Now, all of a sudden, you have this emerging set of trade programs through new technology apprenticeship programs, through apprenticeship programs. And I think it's coming at exactly the same moment that you're seeing a huge demand for this from employers. And it's showing up every single monthly job report. You hear this in the small business survey of what's their top issue. Is it finding loans? Is it tax regulations? It's not. It's finding skilled workers with the skills that they need for the jobs that they have. And I think in all the cross-cutting of all of my work is what we're finding is that every single job is becoming high-skilled. Like we used to sort of segment this into high-skilled and low-skilled, but To Jim's point, all these trade jobs are becoming highly skilled. They're involving computers. They're involving other aspects of technology and automation. And so if we're really going to give kids the opportunity and the option to explore these things, we need to be thinking about new models and new pathways. That's what this demonstrates.
Yeah. So Jim, why not do this through the public school system? What kind of challenges might there be, have you encountered to bring this career and technical education through via the Chicago public school system?
Well, quite frankly, our fear is the lack of flexibility we would have as this program develops. There's going to be many things we may need to do. It may take some kids 5 years to get through our program and another kid 3 years. Mm-hmm. We want to be able to have the flexibility to pivot and do what we find is going to make sense and is working.
Yeah.
This is really an experiment for us, but we've for 130 years, we've been training the next generation of tradesmen. It's our tradition. That's one of the main things we do outside of negotiate contracts, and we carry our own benefit packages. And this is extremely important to us. And we have to, as a movement, more now than ever, we have to look like and be part of our community, and we can't leave part of our community out. And that's what's going on right now. The public school system has failed these kids. As I've told you guys earlier, in another life, I was a Chicago fireman and EMT, and I was in Inglewood at, if you know the heart of it, I was in the heart of it at 71st and Emerald. And, what you see these families up against is mind-boggling. And to think that a young kid coming out of that program could compete for the jobs that are out there now in our industry and say that they got we're going to leave it to the system that's been in place, it just isn't going to work, and it hasn't worked. Like I said, our numbers are abysmal. They're only 8% of our workforce, and that's ridiculous. It should be twice that or 3 times that. Yeah, and right. This is one of the paths we want to use to try to achieve this.
Does this make sense to you, John? Can the private school system, does it have any advantages versus the public school approach to doing this? And can it work within a private school sort of construct, you think?
Yeah.
I was going to ask John.
You go first.
Yeah.
Was it me or him?
I know what you're going to say, but I was going to ask John.
I was going to say what he was going to say. First of all, I think the challenge is so great, both on the employer demand side, and also the challenge is so great in reaching this generation of students that you need all hands on deck. We have to sort of be multifaceted and think about different ways this can work in public schools, ways this can work in private schools, ways this can work in charter schools. So I'm optimistic. I think where you're going to see some of them, we always see a lot of the most early sort of stages of experimentation is in sort of the private side, just because they have a little bit more flexibility to create something from scratch, to try something, see if it works. It's part of the reason you see a lot of the entrepreneurial energy inside of charters. It's not to say that public schools can't do that. It's just that I think there's a permission set to try to experiment and try something new, often in meeting a very, very local felt community need that's very real, not just felt, but real. And these private vehicles create a way to do that.
Now, Jim, describe how it might work in practice, right? It's a 4-year program. You're going to try to identify kids when they're 6th and 7th and 8th grade, and then bring them through this high school program. Yes. It's a real high school. In your model, at least to begin with, there'll be 4 trades that these kids might be able to choose or be channeled to.
4 basic trades.
Yeah. So how would it work in practice, just at a high level, so people understand what your vision is?
If ideally, this community of kids are going to be, it could very well be and should be that kid who could, go to college but wants to work with his hands. Right. Those type of kids, give them that opportunity, show them, the possibilities. At the 6th and 7th grade level, we're going to be doing field trips with their families to our training sites, show them, why math is important, why English is important, why writing is going to be important to you in this industry, and then grade in, spend that first 2 years learning the basics of any high school with a peppering of some vocational programs, and then that last 2 years, we're channeling you, through our mentoring, either towards one of those trades. And that last year and a half, you will be spending a portion of the week at our training sites, not in the school.
Where are those training sites?
They're located all within the northern Illinois area. Most of them fairly close to the Chicago metropolitan
Does this
area.
work from a policy perspective?
I think the one of the things that our education movement needs to understand is the amount of expertise and some of the future of workforce training and education is already here. It exists in the facilities that are out there that a lot of us haven't even gone to. I mean, there's a lot of focus and core competency in these areas of, complex electrical training and, on the engineering operating side. And I think what's exciting from the policy perspective is the kind of unbundling of education from one single building site. So if you can design a system that, yes, there's a starting point, there's a place where a kid comes to school, but how their playlist is curated depends on who that kid is and where that expertise is physically located. So if we're going to have someone have the experience of an apprenticeship at the engineers 150 facility, we'll go to where the best education happens. It's in their facility. Same with electricians, same with other industries. So the idea of kind of redesigning this outside of one physical space and using the resources and core competencies of the city of Chicago is also, again, I think it's in this private system, we can develop and design new ways of approaching getting kids what they need.
And so how about the policy itself? What could be, does the policy need to be changed in some ways to accommodate this? What's the opportunity policy-wise?
Yeah, and I'll let Jim take the other half of this. I think the big core piece is we don't have corporate involvement in the scholarship program. So in order for this to be changed, corporations have to be able to target their donation. And it makes sense that this gets aligned with their own industry needs. So if in working with engineers, there's a need for a more diverse workforce, there's an ability to create some funds with a corporate targeted donation to allow those kids to have the finances to be able to afford such a system. So those kind of big, broad changes are the things that need to happen to be able to build the funding and the ability to finance the schools.
Does that make sense, Jim? Do you see this working beyond the trades? Could you imagine other corporate sort of partnerships emerging?
The only way we're going to get our arms around this problem is everyone has to help.
Yeah.
And it can't be just the construction industry. Like I said, we cover 3 states, and last year which was the best year we ever had, we brought in 480 apprentices over a 3-state area. It's the same for the electricians. Last year in the state of Illinois, there were 10,000 apprentices made out of 13 million people. So, what we want to be is the example of what, the corporate side of the equation should be doing here. In Chicago via either Google or Boeing or the others, to take a similar type of model and use that as well. But first things first, we got to get ours off the ground, and we've brought in the developers, the end users are all willing to help subsidize this school. And what we'd like to do it is through a tax program.
Use the tax credit policy to help pay for the tuition effectively. Right. So John, what do you see an interest in corporate America for this sort of approach to training kids at that age, in the high school time frame, and willingness to partner with private school operators like this to create more trained young people for their professions that they care about?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's like necessity that every employer is saying that they're having a difficult time finding workers with the skills that they need to do these jobs, and that pressure is creating interest and willingness to look not just to sort of career exploration. That's kind of like where we were like maybe 15 years ago. It's like, how do you expose students to help them understand like what it means to be an electrician or to do this in this trade or this and that trade. Now I think there's a willingness to sort of push this down. And I think we're also into the system. I also think you're seeing this renewal of interest in CTE. At AI, we did a look at all the state addresses. So this is where there's State of the Unions that governors do at the beginning of the year. And CTE was the most talked about issue next to K-12 funding last year. where governors and where mayors are struggling is that when they're saying they want to do something here, but the playbook they're being given is a very dated playbook. It's a playbook from back in the 90s, and so they're looking for innovative ideas like this. The third area where I think there's just complications is that for too long, things like the tax credit scholarship program, it gets caught in this like very old debate about school choice. And school choice has always been about, do you go from a bad school to a good school? And increasingly where the choice movement is headed is about, it's not about a good school or a bad school, it's about a different school. Which just I think makes more intuitive sense to parents, and it's about every single one of your kids are a little bit different. They have different talents, different aptitudes, different interests, different passions, and some students are going to want to go to an art school, some students are going to want to go into a trade school, and that's part of the way that they're going to learn a lot of the basics, but it's going to be the way that they explore a career. Apprenticeships just make so much sense too. This is having a rebirth in the country right now. A lot of interest in what's going on in Switzerland, but we've had apprenticeships here in the country for decades. It's now becoming sort of more talked about, but it makes so much sense. Like we just learn by doing things and by experiencing it, not just by what's going on in the classroom. So bringing that into K-12, it's going to be really powerful. Tom Vander Ark's in the audience. He's probably been to more schools in the country than almost anyone, and so he's seen different ways that this is sort of playing out across the country of apprenticeships in CTE, apprenticeships with technology, apprenticeships in a separate school, apprenticeships within a school. So I'm very optimistic or the trajectory over this over the next couple of years.
Jim, when you look at the tax credit policy as it's designed today, its focus is on providing opportunities for low and lower middle income families to have access to an alternative to the public school system in their neighborhoods. Is this on the radar screen of your members, and should the policy be modified to allow more middle-income families to have a shot at this? What's your sort of sense from your membership?
Again, depending where you live.
Yeah.
I mean, I grew up and I still live on the south side of Chicago. I was a product of the Chicago Catholic school system for lack of any, alternative.
You had no choice. Your parents insisted that you go to a Catholic
well,
school.
Yeah, well, my mother, wherever she tells me to go, I will. So for city residents, absolutely, this is something that they would want as an alternative, depending on where you live, and depending on the quality of the schools. So with our membership, it would depend on all those things.
Yeah. Myles, is there anything that we should be doing to work towards modifying the policy to accommodate this sort of innovation that we're seeing from Jim and his people?
Yeah. I mean, I just reflect back what Jim said. I think it's, what we believe that these options are for is really contextual to the needs of the kid, depending on who they are and where they live. So if a child has the skill set or kind of the desire to enter into the trades, we want that option available to them. We see the options of safety. Sometimes the school that they're in is just not safe. The story I started with, that's a need. And for the members of 150, it may be an issue of safety, it may be an issue of fit, but I don't think that these issues, especially in Chicago, are restricted by income. Certainly upper income, every option's on the table. But having been there myself and in my own family, we moved out of Chicago. We could not find an option that worked for our kids. So I'm sure that this is true for all of your members that are living in Chicago, depending on who their kids are and where they live.
Yeah. Okay. Well, with that, maybe I'll open it up to the floor. Are there any questions at all for our panelists here that we might be able to help with? I think there's a microphone in the back there.
It's a quiet crowd.
Yeah.
How about Jason? You have a question? Yeah.
I have many questions. What are any major barriers to making this happen? It seems to make practical sense to me that there's a demand for this. Families would want it. Students would want it. Who doesn't want this, or what are the barriers in the way here?
Oh, I can tell you that our a mayor-elect is on board with this as well. In our meetings with her prior to her election, which if you don't know, if anybody ever had a mandate, she had a mandate. I don't think I know anybody that's won every single ward in the city of Chicago. in an election. She gets it, she embraces it, and we're going to be rolling it out. I don't, we don't need and we don't actually want state or local money. We want to have this our own privately run, like our apprenticeship programs are now. We've done it for, like I said, 130 years. This is nothing but an extension down into the high school level, which we used to do generations ago. By hook or crook, we're going to get this done.
Myles, what do you think? Anything in the way of it?
Yeah, I think the way that maybe school choice is perceived, it's perceived with the current set of schools that exist. To me, it doesn't make sense, but I think a barrier is, there's just a perception that this isn't going to be used for innovation. So, this model as something on the table that the funding would work toward, we need to get into more hearts and minds around. I think that existing space used to be filled by the charter sector, but really the charter sector, they've gotten themselves constrained, and the innovation just isn't as strong or as flexible as what we're going for. And I think it's an issue of perception.
Yeah, John?
Yeah, maybe just, two things. It's interesting kind of operating kind of in different sectors. So it's kind of the cool thing about my job is that I get to sort of dive into adult education or workforce education and then sort of go back down into K-12. And it makes you realize just what a sort of oddity K-12 education is. That when we talk about school choice there, it's so toxic, but when you go into workforce, it's just, there's no designation, there's no difference between nonprofit providers, public providers, or private providers. When we fight over sort of school choice mechanisms, the biggest fight in the workforce space right now is what type of employer accounts to give. Lifelong learning accounts is something the Aspen Institute came out with. The Aspen Institute, Progressive Aspen Institute, talking about accounts that are consumer directed to pick the right amount of courses and other support services to help them get a job. So it's just, K-12 is sort of like locked into an old and somewhat stale debate there. But again, I think there's just so much energy in this right now because of the challenges of finding these skilled workers. The economy and the pace at which it's changing is just putting more and more demand on the system. The only other thing that I think could help politically is a little bit, Jim, to your question about should this be expanded to middle class? And I think a lesson I've been reflecting on a little bit is having been involved in philanthropy and public policy that directed and always prioritized low-income students first, I think is absolutely the right place to put the emphasis. But we did that at a little bit of a disadvantage at not also offering reform and other opportunities for middle class families who were feeling economic anxiety and a lot of other education anxieties.
We know that's the case in Chicago for sure.
Yeah, and so I think the only way to build the political support to pass some of these things is having an answer not just for low-income students, but also an answer for middle-class families
Makes
as
sense.
well.
Yes, please in the back, yeah. Oh no, laryngitis.
I was just going to ask the exact same question. How do we, once something becomes a good idea, how do we make it accessible to those who need it the most? And you go back to this whole charter school or selective school process. Once it's a good idea, it becomes really, really competitive. And how do we take something like this and ensure that there is equity and access for those students who need it most? And your point about making options also available to the middle class just means, I'd love to hear your approach about how we make that happen.
Yeah, I think that's the core focus of what we're working on, right? So I expect this school to be very competitive. There'll be a longer line for people to get in than there will be slots. And so our job is to build an outreach and kind of feeder network that's making sure that the kids who need this system most are being identified, are being recruited, and have the scholarships and dollars to be able to support tuition, to be able to pay for it.
Jim, you talked about this offline, but what does this sort of job mean in those communities you're trying to target? Why is this so important to these inner city communities, the kind of work you're talking about?
Because for many of them, it is a real and tangible way they can bring themselves out of that neighborhood and into the middle class. And, you know, because they see our job. We're in the streets, either replacing gas mains or running cranes, putting big buildings together, and they see the electricians and the carpenters. They understand what we do, and they think that that's attainable. And what we have to do is help them attain it. And to your question, you know, how do we make sure that the people we're targeting, because part of my reasoning behind wanting to use only private dollars and run this ourselves is because that's exactly what I want to do. I want to discriminate and just go for those kids. I want to push those communities to give me your best and let me try to plug you in our program, because that's where we see the issue. And I firmly believe if we can make this model work there, this model now works in Elkhart, Indiana, and Rock Falls, Illinois, to bring in those community kids. Because I'd much rather bring kids in this way than open it up to 5,000 applications and you know, have to cut down to 1,000 and then run a program where every week I bring 100 in and cut 75 and break 75 additional hearts to get them into our.
Well, more importantly, these are kids you're going to know from 7th, 8th, 9th grade too.
They're going to be
a
different quality. I'm not going to be retooling college-educated kids into our programs, because that just comes with its own set of issues that we've run into. So, you know, I'm very excited about this.
Any other questions for right here, first row? Oh, I'm sorry. The woman, you're going to have to wait because I didn't see this woman with the microphone.
How are you?
Yes. Hi.
So some of you might know that the tax credit proposal, education scholarship tax credit proposal on Capitol Hill, is now pending in the Senate and the House. And the Senate version, it was interesting because for about a year and a half, when many of us were going around talking to lawmakers, of course, their entire attitude was, no, 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 we don't want to do this, until some of us started talking about workforce and apprenticeships. And suddenly people, to your point, Jim, started saying, wow, if this could actually be part of it spent on apprenticeships, training, things that, the state decides, we decide. And then it all shifted. I had union legislators, Democrat and Republican, saying yes, yes, yes. Flash forward, it was going to be part, it still is part of Senator Cruz's proposal, but the department and others said, this is a really bad idea. So I'm wondering how you take what you're doing and how we market this even, or just communicate it to people who should want and understand that it doesn't dilute choice to open up and scale options. And whether you're hearing that same pushback, because I was struck at how odd that was, because this alignment is exactly what is and should be happening elsewhere and could be happening more.
You know, the first instinct at the idea of opening up tax credit scholarships to our friends in labor and apprenticeship programs, our partners wanted to do this. They didn't want to share. And our attitude is, more pathways, more kids, more access, the better. We want to make this bigger and more accessible to more people. I think to me it's common sense, but I don't know that the education reform movement has been so friendly to labor over time. And honestly, I think some of those historical issues are the barrier. And someone's got to reach out and start making those friendships. And I do think more things are possible.
Any other questions, please? Microphone here in the front. Thanks.
Thanks. I was amazed by that stat that that CTE is biggest, the number one or number two issue that the governors are talking about in their State of the States. I guess my question is, where, if you look across the country, is it being done really well, creating these pathways and around CTE? And what does the new playbook look like in a way that's different than you were saying it was done back in the 90s?
It's a great question. Some of this goes back to the previous question too about scaling. That as evidenced by Tom Van Ark again's visited amazing schools around the country, public, private, and charter. America Succeeds here. They've had amazing conversations around the country regionally about employer needs and about ways that education can help respond to it. It's not that we don't have a shortage of pilots or examples, it's that we do have huge problems with scaling and sort of aligning public policies that remove barriers, that align sort of funding streams to kind of help accelerate these. governors are struggling with this in part because right now, Perkins, which was passed by Congress, now all states are writing their Perkins plans for their federal funds. So it's a little bit kind of what ESSA was about 3 years ago for us in the K-12 world. But again, there's not a huge amount of technical assistance that's going to help with creative ways to do that. States doing some really creative work. Tennessee governor, his first legislative effort was to push some CTE reforms. South Carolina's apprenticeship model is heralded for a number of different reasons, in part because there's a tax credit associated with employers to help work on it. John White, who just walked into the room, has been doing some amazing things with industry credentials as well as some other workforce issues in the state of Louisiana. Again, there's lots of really creative and interesting things happening from a policy perspective, from a city perspective, from a school perspective. We just need a little bit better at helping us sort of aggregate some of that and put it out as a playbook for others to replicate.
And Illinois is next.
Yes.
That's how we look at it. Well, with
Because
that,
we're talking about Illinois.
I think the time is up here. So thank you very much, panelists, and thank you for all attending today.